I was just helping my boss move boxes. Then she smiled and said, "Now move me too." It started as an ordinary morning at the office. I had been settling into my routine, coffee in hand, half listening to the hum of computers and the occasional chatter of coworkers. That's when my boss, a woman in her early 40s with a calm authority that somehow softened the room rather than commanding it, appeared at the doorway of the storage room. "Can you give me a hand with these boxes?" she asked, her voice warm but tinged with that subtle edge of expectation that reminded me why she ran the team so effortlessly. I nodded, eager to help, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was walking into. The storage area smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, the lights slightly dim, giving the space a quiet, almost private atmosphere. She moved with a grace I didn't expect for someone so focused on efficiency, lifting, stacking, and labeling without a hint of strain. I followed her lead, careful to match her pace. Every so often, our hands brushed accidentally while passing a box. The touches were brief but electric, a flash of warmth I couldn't ignore. She glanced at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged in a way that had nothing to do with lifting heavy objects. It wasn't just her movements that caught me off guard. It was the way she observed the world. Her eyes scanned the boxes and the room with a quiet attentiveness, a combination of intelligence and patience that made me want to watch her longer than necessary. And then there was the scent. A subtle perfume that lingered whenever she passed close enough for me to notice, just enough to make the mundane task of moving boxes feel like something out of a memory I wasn't sure I wanted to leave behind. We worked in rhythm, the physicality of lifting, bending, and carrying slowly melting the usual boundaries between employee and boss. She joked softly about my technique, and I teased back, careful to keep the tone light but finding myself more aware of her laughter than I probably should have been. Every glance felt loaded, every accidental touch a spark I didn't know how to ignore. By the time we had finished stacking the last box, I realized my heart was racing. Not from the work itself, but from being close to her, from the warmth of her presence, and the way her attention seemed to linger on me, even briefly. She leaned against the counter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and I caught myself noticing the curve of her smile, the way her confidence softened when she thought no one was paying attention. I had expected a simple task. What I hadn't expected was how watching her, being near her, could make something so ordinary feel so extraordinary. In that quiet storage room, with the scent of cardboard and her subtle perfume in the air, I realized that helping her was no longer just about work. It was about being near her, even if just for a few minutes. And as I caught her looking at me with a hint of amusement and something else, something I couldn't quite name, I felt a flutter in my chest, the kind that tells you everything is about to change, slowly, in ways you don't yet understand. We had just finished stacking the last of the boxes, their corners lined up neatly against the wall like tiny monuments to our teamwork. I wiped my hands on my jeans, feeling the faint sting of strain from lifting heavier boxes than I realized I could handle. She leaned against the edge of the counter, arms crossed casually, but there was a softness in her posture that made her seem less untouchable than her office persona suggested. Then she said it. "Now move me too," she said, her tone light and teasing, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something mischievous, almost daring. I froze, caught between the absurdity of the words and the sudden weight of their unspoken undertone. I wanted to laugh, wanted to tell her she was joking, but the way she tilted her head, that faint curve of a smile, made me hesitate. It was a smile that seemed to know exactly what it was doing, drawing me closer, testing boundaries, and letting me glimpse a playful side I hadn't seen before. I shifted my weight, trying to act casual. I think the boxes are easier to move than, well, I said, attempting a light-hearted tone, though my voice betrayed a slight tremor. Her laughter broke the tension, soft, warm, and low, filling the small storage room. It brushed against me like a gentle breeze, and I realized my chest had gone tight with something I couldn't quite name. She leaned a little closer, just enough that the space between us felt charged. The scent of her perfume drifted toward me again, sweet but subtle, making the air feel heavier, more intimate. She reached out, lightly brushing her hand against my arm, not with the purpose of guiding, just a fleeting touch that lingered for a heartbeat too long. My fingers itched to linger in the warmth of that contact, to feel the soft curve of her hand. But I held back, reminding myself that this was just a playful moment. Yet, in that pause, something shifted. The air seemed to hum around us. The mundane act of finishing a task transformed into a quiet, unspoken conversation. Her eyes held mine a second longer than necessary, and I caught the almost imperceptible sparkle of curiosity, and maybe something else, there. "I'm serious," she said, leaning slightly on the counter, arms folded again, her tone teasing but undeniably confident. The corner of her mouth quirked upward, and I realized she wasn't just joking. She was inviting me into a space of intimacy I hadn't expected. I swallowed, heart hammering, and gave her a small, nervous smile. "I think I might need instructions first," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my attempt at humor. She laughed again, that soft, melodic sound that made the back of my neck tingle. "I'll make it easy," she teased, and for a moment, our eyes locked, filled with a mixture of amusement, curiosity, and something quietly electric that neither of us had yet named. In that instant, I realized this was no longer just about helping her with boxes. Every glance, every fleeting touch, every teasing word was pulling us closer in ways neither of us fully understood yet. And for the first time, I felt the unmistakable pull of a slow-burning tension, a quiet anticipation of something far more intimate, waiting just beneath the surface. After that teasing move me to moment, the atmosphere between us shifted subtly. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden confessions or intense glances, but the rhythm of our interactions felt different, almost electric in its quietness. The office, usually just a place for tasks and deadlines, became a space where small moments began to carry weight. I found myself noticing the little things. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the way her eyes softened when she smiled at a passing joke, the faint warmth of her hand when it brushed mine during a shared task. Even the sound of her laughter, low and musical, seemed to linger in the room long after she had stopped talking. We began working together on minor office setups. A shelf that needed rearranging, a stack of papers to sort, a few packages that required careful handling. There was a comfort in these shared, mundane tasks. She would occasionally nudge me gently if I was reaching awkwardly for something, her hand brushing against my shoulder for balance, and I couldn't help but notice the warmth that lingered after contact. It was subtle, yet it spoke louder than words ever could. Our conversations, too, began to drift beyond office necessities. She asked about my weekend plans, my favorite music, even what I found inspiring. I listened as she spoke, captivated by the blend of confidence and vulnerability in her voice. She never overshared, but there was a trust forming in the way she allowed glimpses of herself to surface. Quiet admissions about stress at work, fleeting thoughts about things she enjoyed but rarely had time for. I responded with honesty, careful not to overshare either, but feeling an unusual ease in opening up to her. There was a rare kind of connection forming, one that didn't depend on titles or hierarchy. It was grounded in simple, human moments. Laughter over spilled coffee, shared frustration over stubborn office equipment, and the playful banter that seemed to stretch time, making the workday feel lighter. Even our silences carried meaning. Sometimes we'd pause together, standing near the window as sunlight spilled across the office floor. The warmth on our skin, the quiet hum of the city outside, and the occasional brush of her hand against mine. These fleeting touches seemed deliberate, though unspoken, a subtle language that only we were starting to understand. In these moments, I realized that my attention to her was no longer purely professional. My admiration had softened into something more intricate, a mixture of curiosity, care, and quiet longing. I wanted to be near her, not just to help, but to share these small, unremarkable moments that suddenly felt extraordinary. By the end of the day, as we straightened the last few items and prepared to leave, I caught her watching me with a hint of amusement and perhaps something more, a spark that mirrored the growing tension between us. It was the kind of look that lingered in the memory long after the office lights went out, leaving me aware that this slow, subtle pull between us was only beginning to take shape. It was a quiet afternoon, the office dimmed by the soft glow of the late sun streaming through the blinds. The usual buzz of keyboards and ringing phones had quieted down, leaving only the subtle sounds of paper shuffling and distant traffic. I was organizing some files when I noticed her leaning back in her chair, eyes tracing the ceiling as though lost in thought. "Busy?" I asked lightly, not wanting to intrude but drawn to the rare pause in her usually composed demeanor. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't carefully curated, something fragile hiding beneath her confident exterior. "Not really," she admitted softly. "Just thinking." Her voice carried a faint weight, a quiet tiredness that seemed almost out of place for someone always so composed. I pulled a chair closer, offering silent company rather than forcing conversation. She glanced at me, a faint smile playing on her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Then, almost hesitantly, she began to share a small piece of herself. The stress of juggling responsibilities, the fleeting moments of loneliness in a life that always seemed full to the brim, the worry that she didn't have enough time for herself. Her words were soft, yet there was an honesty in them that made the room feel warmer, more intimate. I listened, careful not to interrupt, feeling the weight of her trust and the unusual privilege of witnessing this side of her. When she looked down, her fingers absently brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, I realized how rare these moments were, and how delicate the space between us had become. I offered a quiet reassurance. "I can't imagine how hard that must be, but you handle it better than anyone I know." My words were simple, but I hoped they conveyed sincerity without crossing any boundaries. Her gaze met mine, lingering a little longer than necessary. A faint flush warmed her cheeks, subtle but undeniable, and for a brief moment, the professional distance we always maintained melted just slightly. She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the desk and her chin on her hand, her fingers brushing my wrist accidentally as she adjusted her position. The touch was fleeting, yet it sent a warmth straight to my chest. We didn't need to fill the silence with words. The quiet shared between us, the unspoken understanding, the gentle gestures, the ease in simply being near one another, carried its own weight. I noticed the soft rise and fall of her shoulders as she exhaled, the shimmer of sunlight catching in her hair, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the faint aroma of coffee from my cup. Each small detail felt magnified, every subtle movement holding a quiet intimacy. By the time she leaned back fully, a small, genuine smile breaking through, I felt a shift in our connection. There was admiration, certainly, but also something deeper. A protective instinct, a desire to offer comfort, and an unspoken acknowledgment of the vulnerability she had allowed me to witness. In that quiet space, I realized our relationship was evolving in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just playful teasing or brief touches anymore. It was the beginning of something more profound, a slow-burn intimacy rooted in trust, observation, and shared humanity. And though neither of us said it aloud, I knew the pull between us had deepened, subtle yet undeniable, and the real journey was only just beginning. It was one of those rare late afternoons when the office felt almost suspended in time. The overhead lights softened, the hum of computers quieter than usual, and the sunlight spilling in through the blinds created golden stripes across the floor. We were tackling the final task of the day, moving a heavy cabinet into a tight corner. The work required coordination, careful timing, and, unavoidably, close proximity. As we maneuvered the cabinet, our shoulders brushed repeatedly. Each touch was fleeting yet loaded, and I felt a warm awareness grow in my chest, the kind that made it impossible to ignore the space she occupied. I caught the scent of her perfume, subtle, floral, a little like sunlight filtered through blossoms, and it seemed to settle around me, making the ordinary act of moving furniture feel charged with something unspoken. At one particularly tricky angle, she reached across me to adjust the cabinet, and our hands met briefly on the smooth wood. Her fingers lingered for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, brushing mine almost teasingly. I felt my pulse quicken, my mind suddenly aware of every small movement, every glance, every unintentional brush of skin. "Careful," she said softly, And the tone wasn't just about the cabinet. There was a warmth in her voice, an intimacy that made me catch my breath. She looked up at me, eyes steady, lips slightly parted, and for a moment, words seemed inadequate. All I could do was nod, feeling the magnetic pull of the space between us. As we repositioned the cabinet together, there was a pause, a subtle hesitation where we both realized how close we were standing. I could feel the heat radiating from her arm near mine, the gentle curve of her shoulder brushing against my side, the soft rustle of her blouse as she shifted. Time seemed to stretch, each second amplifying the silent tension that had been simmering between us for days. Her gaze flickered toward mine, then down, then back up again, and I caught the almost imperceptible quiver of her lips as if she were holding back something she wasn't ready to say. I wanted to speak, to close the distance, but even the smallest movement felt monumental. We were both caught in the unspoken rules of proximity, the delicate dance of attraction that neither dared to name. Finally, with the cabinet finally in place, we stepped back, slightly breathless from the effort, and from something else entirely. There was a shared smile, quiet but loaded with meaning. A momentary glance, a brush of hands as we straightened, a heartbeat where the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of us. In that near-intimate space, I realized that this slow-burning tension was no longer just curiosity or admiration. It was desire, soft, respectful, and patient, but undeniable. I was aware of the way her presence made my chest tighten, my palms itch for connection. Yet I also knew that the magic lay in the restraint, in the subtlety of proximity and touch, in the electricity of near misses rather than declarations. As we stepped apart, each returning to our tasks, I felt a quiet exhilaration. Something had shifted irreversibly between us. The playful teasing, the shared glances, the gentle touches, they had all led to this moment. And while nothing had been said aloud, I knew with certainty that the slow burn was now a fire smoldering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to flare. The office was quiet that evening, the soft hum of the air conditioner blending with the distant sounds of traffic outside. We were finishing up the last of the day's work, stacking supplies, organizing files, and straightening the little corners of the office that often went unnoticed. It was routine, yet nothing about tonight felt ordinary. There was a quiet electricity in the air, a subtle anticipation neither of us spoke aloud. She leaned against the edge of her desk, arms folded loosely, watching me with that familiar mixture of amusement and something softer, almost vulnerable. I felt a flicker of nerves at being under her gaze. It wasn't just admiration I sensed in her eyes, but curiosity, recognition, perhaps even affection. My chest tightened, and I found myself acutely aware of the small space between us. "You've been really helpful today," she said softly, her tone casual, yet layered with meaning. I felt a warmth creep into my cheeks, not just from the compliment, but from the way she said it. Her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I noticed the faint sparkle in them, a mixture of gratitude and something quietly intimate. I smiled, careful to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted to make things easier for you. You've done so much already." It felt like the least I could do. My words were simple but deliberate. I wanted her to know I saw her effort, her grace, and the strength she carried behind her composed exterior. She stepped closer, just enough that the warmth from her presence brushed against me. I could catch the faint scent of her perfume again, subtle and comforting, and it made the world outside the office seem distant and unimportant. She placed a folder on the desk beside me, her fingers brushing mine briefly. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a quiet spark through me, a silent acknowledgment of the connection that had been growing between us. "I appreciate you noticing," she said, a small, almost shy smile tugging at her lips. The pause that followed was heavy with meaning. Neither of us spoke, but the weight of what lingered in the air was undeniable. Our previous touches, glances, and shared moments, all playful, careful, and respectful, had built up to this quiet recognition. I felt the urge to speak more, to tell her how these moments affected me, but instead I let my actions speak. I reached up instinctively, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. She didn't pull away, She simply let it happen, her eyes softening. The gesture said everything I couldn't yet voice. Admiration, attraction, and a quiet reverence for her presence. We shared a long, steady look, the kind that holds unspoken truths and acknowledges them without needing words. In that moment, I knew we both understood the tension, the affection, and the respect that had quietly grown between us. It wasn't a full confession, yet, but it was a subtle, mutual acknowledgement that something significant existed here. As we returned to finishing the task, a gentle ease settled over the room. The teasing, the shared smiles, the lingering touches, all of it now carried a quiet promise. There was no need for grand declarations. The slow-burn intimacy had reached a stage where both of us were acutely aware of the pull, the closeness, and the quiet confession that had passed between us in gestures, glances, and soft words. The office had quieted down entirely. The hum of computers, the distant chatter from the hallway, even the soft ticking of the wall clock seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the two of us in that warm, amber-lit room. The day's work was finally done. The last boxes moved, files organized, and every corner neatly in place. Yet, the mundane tasks that had brought us together now felt inconsequential compared to the unspoken bond that had formed. She leaned against her desk casually, arms crossed, yet the softness in her posture betrayed a rare vulnerability. Her gaze met mine, and this time, there was no teasing, no playful challenge, just quiet sincerity. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. Not just for the boxes, but for today, for being here. I swallowed, feeling the warmth rising in my chest. "It's been my pleasure," I said, though the words barely captured what I wanted to express. I wanted her to know how much these moments, small, simple, unremarkable to anyone else, had meant to me. The laughter, the shared efforts, the brief touches, the lingering glances. They had quietly built a connection I couldn't ignore. There was a pause. Then, as if drawn together by some unspoken gravity, we stepped closer. I noticed the subtle details, the gentle curve of her smile, the way the sunlight caught strands of her hair, the faint, comforting scent of her perfume that seemed to fill the space between us. I reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of hair from her face once more, and this time she didn't hesitate. Her hand lingered near mine, the warmth from her skin radiating softly, invitingly. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured. And it wasn't just about the office or the day's work. There was honesty, acknowledgment, and a quiet vulnerability in her tone that made the world outside cease to exist for a heartbeat. We shared a long, steady look, the kind that speaks louder than any words could. Our hands brushed again, fingers almost touching, and I felt the electricity of that slow, building connection we had nurtured over shared tasks, laughter, and quiet confidences. The teasing, the tension, the subtle intimacy. It all coalesced into a singular moment of understanding. Finally, she stepped back slightly, a small, satisfied smile tugging at her lips. "You've made today better," she said softly. I mirrored her smile, realizing that we both understood the significance of what had just passed between us. It wasn't a dramatic confession, nor did it require grand gestures. It was quiet, mutual, and profound. As we gathered our things to leave, there was a lightness in the air. The slow-burn tension had found its resolution. Not in words, but in gestures, glances, and the silent acknowledgement that our connection had changed something fundamental in both of us. I felt grateful, exhilarated, and strangely calm all at once, knowing that this bond, however it might evolve, was real, meaningful, and enduring. And as we stepped out of the office into the soft evening glow, I realized that sometimes, the most profound connections aren't declared with words. They're felt, quietly, deeply, and without tea. If you felt the tension and heartwarming moments in today's story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more slow-burn romances. And tell me in the comments, what would you do if your crush teased you like that? I'd love to hear your thoughts. He need for anything more than shared presence and understanding.